With me today, we've got Jonathan Van Valen, who's just told me that you live near the Rockies, which is one of my favorite parts of the world as well, because I've got a friend who lives there. So welcome to the channel, Jonathan. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Ryan. Pleasure. Yeah.
All right. Well, I really want to get into the meat and potatoes because I know that you've had a near-death experience. But just before we get into that, I'm just interested in a bit of backstory about how you kind of went down this spiritual path. So give us a bit of background about that for the people who don't know about your work.
Sure. Well, as far as my spiritual path, that near-death experience was a significant turning point in it. But it wasn't, by no means was it the beginning. I had uh, I considered it an advantage of not having grown up in a particularly religious or spiritual kind of household at all. That was a box that I didn't have to sort of climb out of to go anywhere else. And so everything about my own sort of spirituality and eventually in the way in which I ended up being able to work with people, it really is born out of my own very direct experience more than anything else. And for which I feel mostly very grateful. So, as far as, uh, so I grew up a regular kid in the suburbs. You know, there were no orange robes and there was no chanting and there really wasn't much of there were no teachers. There was, nothing of that sort. And so to encounter, what a lot of folks would call very unusual or, I'm trying to think of the fancy term, transformative spiritual experience type things wasn't something that was on my radar at all in any way. And if, as a young person, if you had told me stories about that sort of thing, especially when it comes to things like out of body experiences or near death experiences or things that we tend to phrase these days in terms of multidimensional things, I would have scoffed or I would have simply rejected it outright. But after, there comes a point when you've run into so many of those kinds of experiences that it's sort of, if it hasn't already, the mind is just almost forcibly cracked open to to there being more to the story than one previously had given credit for.
So it
And
sounds like you were fairly well in the realist camp for most of your life up until that point.
that's an interesting phrase to me, actually. Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say grounded in that. Certainly, I have a great deal of uh, willingness to understand and be compassionate for folks who would look at some of these alternative sounding things and say, "Wait a minute, what? What now? What? What are you talking about?" And and rather than try to, convince or explain so much, um, it becomes more meaningful, more interesting, and frankly more compelling to work with people in such a way that they simply begin to have a bit of a new kind of experience of their own. Since I think probably most of us listening to this are already familiar with the idea that when what really moves our needle, what really cracks us open is some kind of direct experience of our own. And so it's in that framework that I'm I tend to operate these days. Um, but I'll be happy to talk theory with someone that really wants to. And off we go.
All right. Well, let's get into your NDE. Tell us about what happened there.
Sure. This was the result of a surgical procedure. I was 29 years old, so young person trying to figure out how to be a grown up in the world. And the surgery was actually for a sleep apnea issue that was just a kind of a genetic quirk of factors that created this as an issue. And the solution chosen was a kind of surgery it's rarely done these days, but it basically removes a ton of tissue from the back of your throat and soft palate, and in my case, even a few chips of bone from the skull behind my nose.
Wow.
And one of the reasons it's rarely done, and you'll see why this is a meaningful detail, is that it's an incredibly painful surgery to recover from, and most practitioners just try to urge their patients away from it for numerous reasons, but that's a significant one. The reason it's so painful is that it's just a very, very nerve-rich part of your body, and you have to continue to use it to breathe and to swallow and do things like that. So the analogy given me at the time was that I was going to have to understand what it was like to break my leg and then have to walk on it for days and days. And it is very apt. Um, it was also still a good choice, but this I was in a hospital for 4 days. This is not an operating table situation at all. I was in recovery at the hospital. 4 days later, they let me out, or they sort of boot me out, which sometimes that's healthcare in America, different subject. Uh, uh, and I was released into the care of my father, who I didn't have a perfect relationship with my father, but it was, a very loving act on his part to want to watch over me as I recovered from this. And there was really very little he could do. So he hauls me out to the family farmhouse, and I just kind of point myself out a window, and there's really very little I can do either. And he just sort of literally watches over me as he goes around doing house chores and farm chores and things of that nature. About 3 days into his care is when I experienced what I can only describe as a simple inner click. And it's very palpable to me even today, that there was this moment of this click. And in that moment was immediately clear that my body was beginning to shut down. It was beginning to die. The life force in it was beginning to drain away. And in that same instance of that click, there was a three sort of realizations, revelations that they fled in sort of simultaneously, even though I can only describe them one after the other. But the first of them was simply that in the instant of that click, it was immediately clear to me that I wasn't my body. And the way that was made clear was simply that it was very clear that the body was beginning to lose its life force, but that there was an aware presence that was capable of observing that the life force was draining away from the body, but that aware presence was itself not changed at all. It was not losing its own life force. It wasn't actually even impacted in any way by the fact that this body was losing its life force. And that was not just a sort of a revelation in that moment. It was an extraordinary freedom, because what it meant in that moment was that the pain in that body needn't be claimed either. And so in the recognition of that moment, there was a complete freedom from the suffering. And it was the very first time, and by no means the last, and I hope we get to talk about this more, that I was directly presented with the difference between pain and suffering. Was the pain in the body still there? Yes, absolutely. And it is mind-bending, blackout level pain. Severe. And yet in the moment then of that freedom of, well, if I'm not that body, then that pain isn't me either. I don't have to own it. I don't have to claim it. I don't have to tell a story about it. I don't suffer it. So it's especially when you've been faced with really severe physical pain for an extended period of time, which was, you could paint the picture quite well of it being a real depiction of hell's, a hellish experience. And then to be completely released from it is a sort of moment of freedom that it is difficult to put into word, but it was certainly revelatory in its scope. And a second recognition floated in simultaneously, which was that life force was draining from the body. It was almost like seeing the mercury recede in a thermometer. And it was clear that it was going at a relatively slow rate, and that it was going to take a while for this body to actually complete the dying process. It was going to be a matter of days. And it's not as though I understood exactly how long it was going to be, but it presented in that moment as at least it was going to be a few days. And that was met not with a moment of panic or worry or concern. Actually, the sort of the freedom of that first revelation, what was so great that recognizing that it was going to take a little while was met with a feeling of something like, wow, this is extraordinary. I'm actually going to get to be able to revel in this for a few days and kind of soak it in and soak it up and get to revel in this freedom for a while. And that presented itself as an extraordinary gift. Um, the third thing that floods in, and again, it's all sort of simultaneous, is something that I think might be particularly apropos to the listeners of a podcast who are asking a question like, who am I? And it's one of the reasons that your show caught my attention. And I kind of have to go back to this first recognition that, there's this experience, this very direct experience that I am not this body. But in that awareness, there's also still a sense of separate self. Like there's a sense of self. It's a non-corporeal, individuated sense of self that just isn't tied to this physical form. And yet it still has a sort of individuatedness to it. But in this third sort of recognition that floods in, it's very clear that that individuated but non-corporeal sense of self was dissolving, that too was being let go, that it wasn't really the truest depiction of what or who this is. That individuated sense of self was beginning to dissolve. And as every molecule of life force drains away, so too then is there an equally growing sense of that individuatedness dissolving into what can only be described as well, it's hard to describe, but dissolving into what is overwhelmingly, all-encompassingly all. And what I would stress to anyone about that is that there could not possibly be any sense of loss in it. And the best way I can articulate that is that if something is overwhelmingly all, then it's very whole. It's missing nothing. That's what overwhelmingly all means. And it's where these words like oneness or wholeness or, come from so often. And if it is so overwhelmingly whole, then missing nothing, then there cannot really be any sense of lack or want or need. And that was so. And if there cannot be any sense of lack or want or need, then it's essentially impossible for there to be fear. What could there possibly be to be afraid of if there is no sense of lack or want or need? And so that dissolution of that individuatedness, that dissolution of that sense of self, first, as a corporeal matter, and secondly, as a sort of, begins to be, again, hard to put into words, but if one is sort of dissolving into this overwhelming allness, it contains absolutely everything. And as such, there couldn't be any sense of fear in any way, nor any sense of lack. And so, if there is nothing of the sort, then the sort of natural default setting then is something sort of automatically, something that's profoundly, deeply peaceful. It's totally lacking in fear. And as I'm sure many people listening have heard in some way or another, in some form, fear is often described as the opposite of love. Love is the opposite of fear. And there is a way in which we could say that's very true. From my point of view, and I hope we circle back around to this, in the truly sort of final analysis of all things, even that dichotomy of fear being the opposite of love collapses too. And it ends up being shown that love is essentially all encompassing and really has no opposite. But in the context of a 29-year-old staring out the window, sitting on a couch, having this experience, what it really looks like is just being utterly and completely freed, first of all, from the suffering, but even from even any sense of individuatedness in which that all-encompassing wholeness just feels at hand. And so when my father comes in the room to have a look and, just how's he doing in there? Or is he still upright? Um, there's still nothing for him to do really. And there's no impulse in me in any way to do anything other than just gently smile at my father, feel loving towards him, and not say a single word. There's no sense of in that lack of any kind of sense of lack or want or need. There's no impulse that is, feels impelled. There's no to say, "Hey, Dad, um, I'm dying." That seems irrelevant. It just utterly irrelevant. It all. I mean, looking at my own physical body had the sense of that, or the sort of experience of it was simply like, it's a fine, if illusory, vehicle, but the fact that it might, depart, or that this whole dimension might be left, again, it doesn't come as a problem. It's not seen as an issue. What it really boils down to is that even, blackout, mind-bending level pain, and even the death of this body aren't enough to essentially disturb the peace that is simply at hand. And that's a kind of peace that doesn't really shout. It doesn't really wave its hand much. It's, it doesn't, there's no, it's just extremely simple and gentle. And so the only meaningful response that made any sense at all to me in the moment was simply to look at my father lovingly and feel extraordinarily at peace. And that's how I spent the rest of the afternoon and into the night. For these days, there hadn't really been much of any sleep. And there was, at some point in my mind arises this idea like, hey, maybe I would sleep. That'd probably be nice. um, and I do. But I wake up throughout the night, and every time I wake up, I sort of check in and, am I still dying? Is the mercury continuing to drop? Yes, it is. I can feel that life force ebbing away a little faster, a little more, a little faster. And that merging with the infinite is, again, it's speeding up in exactly the same rate. And by the time I wake in the morning, I recognize that the point when this body actually drops and is done with, permanently, is certainly a lot closer. I still don't know exactly where that point is coming, but it's clearly closer. And somewhere in there, this thought arises that there is going to be a point where there's sort of a point of no return, as we say sometimes in these kind of circles. That's I'll be crossing that threshold. But that presents itself as a choice, a very clear choice, and not a choice that has anything to do with merit or effort or anything of the sort. It presents itself as being as easy as a thought. It's just a simple yes or no. There's no judgment in it in any way whatsoever. And it's been an interesting question to me for a long time, in a sense that, if one is experiencing very, very sincerely and literally directly that what is occasionally called the peace that passes understanding, all-encompassing peace, lack of fear, just feels like everything, there's really nothing to it other than a simple lovingness. Why wouldn't one go that way? Why wouldn't it be a reasonable choice to head for that threshold? It is a reasonable choice, frankly. And so but still an interesting one to contemplate to me. And it was particularly interesting because this additional thought arose, which was, I have the choice, but I think I'm not going to go through that doorway. What surprised me was that there was this corollary that said, I think there's some things I want or need to do here first, which surprised me only because I had no idea what that meant. Like, you, hey, there's some things I need to do on Earth first. Then I'd be happy to go through that doorway. Well, great. I had just literally, I don't know what they are. I'm a 29-year-old, youngish adult trying to figure it out. And so it was sort of like 51%. I was happy to like stay and accommodate that feeling and that thought. Like I guess I'll have to, whatever it is I'm supposed to do here, I guess I'll have to figure it out. And 49% very happy to go. Like it was really quite close. And
I was just thinking, especially given that you're in quite an amount of pain, it would have been
yeah,
quite a sort of, well, I can go back to that, or I can continue on with what looks like a pretty interesting adventure.
yes, absolutely. I mean, the most fascinating adventure, frankly. And but at the same time, to be, let's be clear that that pain in that body was still there. And it's a funny thing to try to describe, but I wasn't suffering it at all. I really was not suffering it. It was, that's why it's sort of the piece that passes understanding. It's hard for it, if you had tried to explain to me before this event that it would be possible to be in that level of pain and that your body was dying and that it wouldn't seem like a big deal at all. It wouldn't even be worthy of paying any attention virtually to that it wouldn't disturb my peace in any way. It would have been an extremely difficult thing to try to explain to me. But faced with that direct experience, it just was simply undeniable to me. That second day, my father, again, kind of comes in and out on a regular basis and checks on me, sees how I'm doing. And I still don't, there's no way I have to explain to him. There's no way I could look him in the eye and say, hey, Dad, I'm dying. And you know what? It's fine. Also, this body, really not important. Not that big a deal. There's no way I could find words to articulate any of this to him in a way that would have been meaningful or understandable to him. I knew that was true on an intellectual basis, but I also knew that certainly at that time, I wouldn't have been able to articulate any of this at all in the first place. I just wouldn't have had the words. In fact, what really had to happen was a whole bunch of years and a whole bunch of additional experiences that were coming my way that would help me sort of understand it, integrate it, sort of, I guess, expand on it, if you will, if that's even a reasonable way to put it. But there was this moment in that second day in which I think, well, I'm inclined to stay. I can't really even make sense of that fully at this moment, but not long after that inner decision is made, my father comes into the room again, but this time his face changes and he looks at me a little funny and squints his eyes at me and he says, Jonathan, I think something's not right. I think we're going to load up the car and head back to the hospital. And I think, well, I kind of made the decision already. So, all right, I guess I'll stay. We'll go. We'll go do the thing. We'll fix whatever. Oh, so it came as sort of a simple outcome of the decision that had been made. And I'm in no hurry at all. I dawdle. It's a 2-hour drive back to the hospital that conducted the surgery in the first place. We show up in the emergency room. I'm in a terrific mood. I can barely speak anyways, because there's been so much that's been done to my throat, but I can eke out a whispered word at most. And doing that is, it's very painful, but it doesn't really matter. And so I'm actually trying to crack jokes to make my dad laugh. He has no idea what's going on really with me. And it's not until we're actually at the hospital that the ER docs confirm that I am in fact dying. And I am dying for the dumbest reason in medical science. I'm dying from dehydration. My body is shutting down from a total lack of intake of the liquids of water. And when you can't really functionally swallow, and it's, it's an absurd situation in many respects. But again, that's a conversation for a completely different forum. But it also means that it means that the solution to this is also obviously very simple. And so they poke an IV bag into my arm with saline solution, and they immediately start to fill my body up with the liquid that it needs. And in the instant that that line is connected, I can feel the mercury begin to rise. That life force begins to reverse. It feels as though it's flowing in, and that merging with the infinite begins to reverse as well. And there's the sense that I really am coming back here. I'm gonna put my feet back on the ground here. And to say goodbye to that threshold and that absolutely all-encompassing peace is also still, oddly, again, there's no sense of loss in that either, in that moment. It's actually sort of a quiet, gentle, simple happiness. And like, I think we're doing the thing that was decided. And so that's just simply seen as right and good. And it's also seen that sort of turning in the opposite direction of that threshold, and the opposite direction of that peace, that freedom, was also no loss, because in that experience, it presented itself as not really going anywhere, that it would always be there anyways. It doesn't mean that I went from this experience to experiencing that level of freedom from that point forward. I absolutely did not. I came back, put my feet back on the ground, but there is still this sense that it's very hard to even understand at that time. Like, well, even if you're not going to go through that threshold now, that is what awaits you in the future, and that's what awaits anyone in the future at some point. And not only that, but there's something about that freedom that is infused in this place. It is available here. It's a part of what and who you are. And so even if you come back here, there's a way in which you're not disconnected from us. And there was something in that was deeply comforting, and was simply, added some heft. It made returning and putting my feet on the ground here seem like a perfectly fine choice. And so it went. They keep me at the hospital for a few hours to observe, make sure everything really is all right, which it is. Take another 2-hour drive back to farmhouse. There's, again, still very little that my father can actually functionally do for me. But I spend the next 3 weeks healing up. And 3 weeks later, I return to my own home. I return to my job. And life picks up pretty much where it left off. And it was as I returned that the sort of ferocity of wanting to understand ramped right up. And it's why I said earlier that perhaps this experience was, it wasn't the be all and end all of my own spiritual experience. But it was a very significant turning point, in the sense that it turned me in a direction of seeking, because as I went back to that job and found myself racing through traffic, maybe a little bit late, trying not to spill a cup of coffee in my lap, and doing all the things that, most of us do on a regular, normal, ordinary day-to-day basis, I couldn't quite reconcile what I felt I knew was true, and knew that I'd seen and knew that I'd experienced. And as I was racing through traffic to get to my job on time, there was thoughts like, well, all of a sudden this body seems very important. All of a sudden this place seems very important. My ambitions here seem very important. How do I square that? In fact, it's what perhaps for me led more than anything to the beginning of questioning of what is this for? In fact, what is this body for? What is all this busyness for? And eventually that leads to questions very naturally like, well, then what is this? What is this? I've spent most of this life, up to this point, feeling like this was me, this body very important. I'm located roughly somewhere in here. And yet this near-death experience has a lot of other things to say about that. It essentially said, there's way more to the story here. There's a lot of things that you simply don't fully understand or grasp about that larger story. And so it was an experience that first and foremost I buried because I couldn't figure out how to reconcile it with the busyness of everyday life. I certainly couldn't figure out how to explain it to anyone. I couldn't look anyone in the eye.
You didn't share it with anybody at all afterwards?
I did not.
Not for a while.
I didn't, not for years, actually. People would ask because they knew I had gone through a surgical procedure, that I'd recovered. And, so they'd hear the story about, oh gosh, yeah, I almost died. Oh, it was really painful, but yeah, it worked out okay. But I completely left out the part about merging into the infinite, or that myself and my body were two different things. And one of them was basically irrelevant. And there's no way that I could communicate the level of peace that I would have wished. And I simply didn't feel capable of communicating it in any way at all. And so I just didn't. So that's the part that was left out. But I couldn't forget at the same time. I just knew I couldn't figure out how to say it in any way that I thought would be meaningful or acceptable or accessible to somebody else. So there was a period of really a bunch of years and a whole host of other experiences. There were other times when I, for other completely unrelated reasons, ended up revisiting what it was like to be in severe pain, for instance. And the details really aren't particularly important, for the moment. But there was a particular occasion, for instance, in which there was a huge issue of pain. And I found myself fighting it in a super masculine dude way. Like I could take it. I could deal with this. I could tough it out. And it just cracked me. I just fell apart. But yeah, it turns out I had that. That was my attitude going in. And there was this experience first over a couple of days in which the first thing was that sort of fighting against that pain just cracked something in me. And I had what a lot of folks would describe as a life review, except it was the worst face of it possible. It was in an instant having a total experience of every kind of pain I'd ever experienced collectively for as long as I could remember, both emotionally and physically. And it just sort of all erupted out of this Pandora's box in me somehow and rendered me just in total breakdown. I went from sitting in a chair to like writhing on the floor, shrieking and bawling, like completely out of control.
Jonathan, how do you feel about sharing the specifics of what caused that pain? Because there'll be people that'll be watching who might have had that same experience, but when you're talking generally, and it's okay to do that, I just want to encourage you to
I've always felt kind of silly about it, in fact, because it wasn't a dramatic event.
It's still your story, though.
Yeah, and I'm perfectly happy to share it. I just get worried about, taking too much time. But because of the fact that so many of these things had turned me into, very quietly, inwardly, a spiritual seeker. And that had ramped up to a real ferocity that I did not share. Like you would never see me walking down the street and think, oh, there's I bet you he carries a yoga mat and he's probably vegan. Not true. No one would have painted me as the the spiritual seeker, but internally it had grown to quite a ferocity, just unmentioned to the outside world. And I went to my first ever meditation retreat. It was a Vipassana meditation retreat. And I did not really know what I was getting myself into, but this was 10 straight days of silence, which was very appealing to me. But it was also essentially seated meditation for just, something like 8 to 10 hours a day. And I was absolutely shocked that sitting with my feet folded beneath me as with my butt on a little meditation bench with all the cushions I could ask for, and that sitting still for long enough made a level of pain arise from the waist down that I was absolutely stunned by. And I thought to myself, I know what real pain feels like. Real pain.
Yeah.
How on earth is
that
this
makes more sense.
possible? How is this even happening? I'm looking down at my own body, sitting essentially comfortably and still, but that pain just began to arise in a way that I could not believe. And so I fought it for really about, a day and a couple of days. And somewhere in there, it just cracked me open. And so now in addition to feeling this physical pain, I have this experience in which the collective pain of all of the suffering I've ever encountered just sort of floods me all at one time. And I have essentially a complete breakdown. And that breakdown takes a twist that, once again, I couldn't have fathomed. And it turns from being an experience of my own collective pain. And it feels as though that individuated mind that I seem to carry around with me merged into what presented itself as all the minds, like all of humanity. It sounds so dramatic. It was experienced as frankly very dramatic, but it was as though this individuated mind felt as though it showed its true colors as a fragment of this vast mind that contained all the minds, like all 8 billion souls, all 8 billion minds are essentially one mind that appear in 8 billion fractals or something like that. And so it went from experiencing my collective pain to experiencing the collective pain of all of the 8 billion. And if there was a level of overwhelm that I felt before, it ramped up to a degree that is so far beyond anything I can put into words. I just can't even begin to even try. But my own sense of overwhelm was just, it probably looked like I was having a seizure. And it was kind of wild. Eventually that aperture begins to close back down. And by eventually, I mean, this is going on for like an hour and a half or some egregiously long period of time for the sake of the fact that there are actually other live human beings at this meditation retreat to whom I offer my condolences. And I walk out just absolutely shell-shocked. And I can't help but be reminded of some of the experiences that I'd had in the past, including that NDE. The next day I sit down on the bench and I think, oh, I don't know if I can do anything. I don't know if I can take it. I don't know if I can do anymore. And on that day, the experience shifts. That pain begins to arise in the body. And it is a sort of a PTSD moment where I'm like, oh, geez, I don't know. And something else happens. And I'm sort of returned in a way to an experience that was very similar to the NDE, in which as that pain begins to arise, I connect with that experience that very, very clearly that is that, wait a minute, this body isn't actually me. And that presents itself when the sort of sense of that individuated self that we normally carry around felt as though it simply expanded, and it expanded beyond the confines of this body, sort of like it filled the room, and then it felt like it sort of filled everything everywhere, became enormous. And there was actually a moment in which it was the literal experience of it was that there was no place in that room or anywhere in my perceptual field that I was not. It's another one of those things. It's a little hard to put into words, but um, it it returned me in a way to that NDE experience so vividly. There was also an added element to it, which was a sort of element of sort of an insight into that mind, the business of mind, in which it felt like this individuated mind merged into the collective mind, and that if the individual pain in this body didn't actually need to cause suffering to this individuated sense of self, it was also clear that even that collective suffering was something cut from the same cloth. They were essentially the same thing. One was on this scale, one was on this scale. They were essentially the same thing. And what that thing presented itself as was what I can best describe. The way it arose in that moment was that that pain was a misthought. It was a mistake in thinking. It was a misuse of mind. It was essentially an unintended and unforced error of mind. And that's what is at the root of suffering. And so again, then in a way, I don't really think I don't think I'm guessing. I don't think I could have experienced what I did there without having had that NDE a number of years before that sort of showed me the way to this place. But there was again this experience then of, well, there's a difference between suffering and pain. There's there may be pain, but I don't actually have to suffer it. And if suffering is itself a misuse of mind or a misthought, then there's something about pain and suffering that is, it's a simple, gentle error. It doesn't require penance. It just requires adjustment. It was sort of how it presented itself. But again, eventually a bell dings and I get up and my mind is blown. I'm like, okay. Okay. I don't know how I'm ever going to go back to work now. I mean, who cares if we're out of stamps back at the office? Because I feel as though it sounds so odd to say that it was like seeing what is the source of suffering? What is the collective source of the suffering of mankind? And essentially being shown like, here's the problem. Here's the kind of experience that shows the way out of it. And then in walking out thinking, well, how do I connect the dots on this? And yet again, the following day, that answer was shown. It was 3 very simple words that I then spent the next many years trying to understand fully. The 3 words were give up judgment. What on earth would that mean? Give up judgment. How does that make sense? How is that the solution to the suffering of mankind?
Judgment of who?
Excellent question. Most of the time it's judgment of others and judgment of ourselves, but that's already putting a bit too much definition on it than it necessarily needs. What the faculty, we have this faculty of judgment in which we categorize things as right, wrong, good, bad, up, down, all kinds of things. There are some ways in which we use that for simple discernment, which is a little different than the kind of judgment I'm talking about. But the judgment in which we, essentially what judgment does is it locks us into a dualistic frame of reference, because it says right, wrong, good, bad, up, down, left, right. And it sort of locks us into this frame of reference in which things are just um, inescapably separated. And in beginning to let go of that framework of judgment, then those opposites can begin to collapse, and something that is less dualistic, more whole, more one, can begin to emerge. And it's in that framework that we begin to understand the misthought, and therefore release the suffering, release the pain, and and begin not to have to suffer it.
So is that something that you struggled a lot with, Jonathan? The judgment?
I think I probably have struggled with it. I don't know. I think it was something that, as someone that was quietly turning into quite the spiritual seeker, there was already a pretty high ethic for wanting to understand, for wanting to seek things that were, essentially kind or gentle, essentially peaceful. But at the same time, uh, like I think most folks, I can I can relate immensely with the experience of being in judgment of others at times, sometimes more, sometimes less, and also being harshly in judgment of myself for whatever. So it would take outward forms, it would take inward forms. And one of the ways I could describe the whole spiritual journey has been a gentle, increasing relinquishment of judgment. That it just it and it does begin to make the world sort of a kinder, gentler place. I want to. There's a lot to unpack on something like this, and I don't want to be clear about a bunch of things. One is it doesn't mean that I don't make choices, sometimes difficult choices. It doesn't mean that I'm inclined to be any particular form of a doormat or put up with, particularly bad behavior from others in all kinds of ways. What it really means ultimately is what framework am I bringing to my experience here in this dimension? Is it a framework that is more cut from that judgmental framework, or is it cut from something that is less judgmental? It's sort of like saying, and I'm borrowing this from some popular sources, is it more egoic, or is it more cut from that sense of something whole and non-egoic? Um, is it is it cut from something loving, or is it cut from something more egoic? And so, one of the thoughts that I've carried around with me a lot is that there is nothing that can be accomplished by fear that can't be better accomplished by something loving. So, I'm still faced with the ups and downs of life. And so it begins to just become a question more and more and more of which framework am I, more inclined to come at it from. And that ends up being a pretty simple binary choice. It doesn't mean it's always easy, or that my own, patterns sort of kick in or don't kick in. Sometimes, that's a learning curve that has been a part of this whole process. But there did come for me eventually a point, and it was many years after that NDE, in which that overwhelming sense of peace, in which the individuated sense of self inside felt like it crumbled and fell apart, fell away in a way that was permanent. And there was a way in which that sense of peace um, just felt like it settled in permanently as well. And it's another one that I find a little difficult to unpack fully, because it doesn't mean that I'm always, perfectly at peace somehow. Life, the slings and arrows of life still fly. And yet there did come a point, sometimes people refer to as an awakening, or something of that nature. There's a lot of words we could use, all of them a little bit tricky. My favorite word is simply a shift in perception came that felt like it settled in permanently. And it was one in which that individuated sense of self indeed felt like it was just seen not momentarily as untrue, but sort of permanently as untrue, even though it's operating in this form that appears to still carry around an individual self with it somehow. It's sort of like saying that allness, that overwhelming allness that contains everything, is so complete that it can even include the sense of an individuated small self. And yet that small self is seen operating in this greater context. And that greater context is what's really true. And that small context is sort of a requirement of this dimension, but that doesn't make it true. Um, and it's that sense has never left from that the point of that sort of shift in awareness.
So I've got something I want you to try on for me.
Sure.
Sometimes I get, I can't really, I'm not a channel or anything like that, but I do get clear messages sometimes with guests, and one that it won't go away. So I have to tell you.
Let's hear it.
So what do you think about that? The judgment, there's just a couple of things you said. A judgment gets in the way of you speaking your truth. I feel like what I need to say is that you have a judgment about whether you're even qualified to talk about what you talk about, and whether your experience actually qualifies you to talk about those things. But the truth is very individual. And I feel like those thoughts actually get in the way of you actually speaking your truth and actually saying what people need to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I encourage you to talk about what actually occurred. People might be thinking, oh, he swallowed nails or something like that. No, he was in a meditation retreat. Now, that's a really interesting story, but you were willing to actually just sort of gloss around that to present something that was a little more palatable, perhaps, to some people. So I guess I have the advantage of having spoken to so many people with so many weird, wonderful experiences that I don't have any judgment about what people say. So that's what I've got to offer you. I think that's what I need to tell you.
I think that's a lovely message. I appreciate hearing it from you, Rod. And there's certainly some truth in it. One of the tendencies I've had is to continue forth with the sense that that I have to choose my words very carefully. And there are times when I have fallen on the side of that makes some sense. Like one of the things I've gotten to learn and live into in a way that's been quite beautiful is that when speaking with someone, you can only speak to them in a language that they can understand. And you have to speak in a way that they can access, that they can speak the language that they can hear. And the flip side of that for me has been far too much caution often in that way. And an inclination to say nothing. So my default setting for many, many years was to say absolutely nothing. And to turn that around and tell all kinds of stories has been part of the journey. And it's one that I've undertaken quite reluctantly.
I applaud you for that, because one path is fairly non-abrasive, and one can result in people thinking about you in ways that may never change, that might not be, how you would like them to think about you.
Yeah.
But the truth is the truth. Your own truth is your own truth. And
True.
nobody should have, nobody has any right for you to have to alter or change that to sort of present some experience.
Yeah.
That's just what happens. You had that experience, but you're NDE.
Yeah.
I think it kind of like it opened somewhat of a channel for you to have to face that aspect of who you actually really are. And now you really don't have any choice but to continue to speak about that, because if you don't, you have those really painful experiences. And I think it's just the only way that greater consciousness, for want of a better word, could get you to move in that direction, because that was the path you had to go in, whether you liked it or not. Sounds like that to
Yeah. Yeah. Whether I liked it or not. Yeah.
me. Yeah.
And it does, I do, I work with that inside myself often. Uh, it's, on one hand, it's why I've said astonishingly little and have been very difficult to find for many years on one side. On the other hand, it's also why I'm delighted to be having this conversation with you today. It's
Yeah.
also why I'm, working on a book. It's why there's a website, many of the usual things. It's also why things like my social media presence is terrible. It's not my natural habitat at all. And it's the sort of thing that if it's going to be loosed upon the world, it will probably be with the help and support of others, perhaps. But
Well, you know what? None of that matters. But you did get me into my next question, because I feel like the story that you've told is the one that had to be told. So tell us about
Mhm.
what you've got going on, as far as, what services you offer to people. Tell us what you're
Sure,
doing with your book. Once you publish your book, I always say, because I've had a lot of people who are writing books, I say, keep
sure,
writing it. And when you're done, come back and tell us about it. So tell us what you
yeah,
got going on there, how people can get in
sure.
touch with you as well.
Well, I'd love to, and I appreciate that. For the record, these days, I don't feel like there's anything better to be doing with my time than things like this. So I'm glad to be here for that reason and share this stuff. So I do tend to reach back to anyone that reaches out to me. So far, I have a perfect or nearly perfect track record in that. There, the book is going to be um, it's definitely going to be an account of many of my own experiences, but I've opted to write it in the format of a conversation between two characters. And that's a very old trope, but it's one that I'm very fond of. And I feel like it offers a lot of opportunity to go back and forth like this and work with questions and answers and things like that. So that's what I'm and really enjoying in the book. And the I don't know when that book is coming out. I really started working on it with real sincerity only in the past month or couple of months, really. So it's a rather new project for me, but it's one I'm quite devoted to, which is actually why I'm shutting down a lot of other aspects of life actually to go and work on it and be quite devoted to it. So
Good
that's
for
going to
you.
be interesting and
Keep
fun.
going. Keep going.
Yeah.
I know what it's like. I've written half of a novel and still haven't finished it.
Well, I can appreciate that very much, and it's definitely a new creative task that I'm enjoying, even though I find it genuinely challenging. Um, so there's along the way, one of the things that cropped up was a essentially a sort of this is a word I remain yet uncomfortable with, but a sort of a healing modality that arose in me that um, that was is so simple, and uh, it took the form that this began a bunch of years ago now, in which that inner prompt arose, and it was like, you could be helpful to this person. You don't even have to say anything if you don't want to. But what you would need to do, and this still sounds odd to me, is put your hand on their head. I would have to put my hand on this person's head. And of course, that sort of thing has been going on in human history for millennia. But to me, it still seemed quite odd. Um, and that's one of the ways that I work with people. In fact, what it usually results in is having some silence with this person, whether actually putting a hand on their head or not. And to me, that experience is one in which there's sort of a connecting at that level of mind. And uh, my role in it is simply to put my own awareness on that that aspect of consciousness that uh, where that sense of individuated sense of self just simply isn't there. It's sort of like going to a quiet place in which even the movements of mind that would confer a sense of self are ceased. And this would be true of anyone if that mind, comes to a stillness of a certain stillness, then that sense of self that's driven by that mind will quiet down in anyone.
Mm.
And so my only sort of job in that scenario is to quiet down to that place. And it's like revisiting the experience that I've tried to articulate a couple of times here today, in which if there's no sense of self in it, then there's no sense of separation. If there's no sense of separation at all, then there's this sort of experience that there's this overwhelming allness. And it's as though that allness here meets the allness there in that other person and sees that it's identical, that there's no difference in it at all.
Mm.
Um, and if it is that allness, then there's what's curious is that, and this is why the word healer has always been felt a little odd, is that there is no sense in that whatsoever of a volitional self making a choice to do something healing. If I've just said out of one side of my mouth, there's no sense of an individuated self there, then how could there be a self to decide to move some energy or heal a thing? There isn't. It's none of that. It's always been kind of funny to try to describe because it's easier to describe what it isn't. Am I checking the Akashic records? No. Am I checking on past lives? No. Am I polishing someone's aura or shining up their chakras? No. Am I doing Reiki? Absolutely not. Am I, seeking intuitive information? Not really. Um, it, it's like seeing their innate wholeness in which there's nothing broken to begin with. And if there's nothing broken to begin with, then there's no sense of there being something needing to be healed in the first place.
So it just helps people have a better experience of life.
It's how it shows up in other people is remarkably and massively variable. There are people that have described it as a healing experience. There are many people that would describe it as a peaceful experience. Some, probably one of the most common things that people would report is a sort of level of stillness and peace in themselves that is unusual for them. And they simply find that often very healing. A lot of times.
I like that it evades labels.
Yeah. And it's why it's been historically very difficult. This says, well, so what do you do? What's your thing? Well, I'm not really, well,
So
are
let
you
me
a
show
healer?
you.
I wouldn't say it's me. I wouldn't say I have much to do with it at all. Um,
I think the good
well,
healers would say the same thing is say, well, I'm not really healing you. It's you that's doing it.
I think you're right, Rod. I really do.
Mm.
My best way of understanding is that it's as though some aspect of that underlying allness, that underlying wholeness sort of rises up in their awareness in some way that makes sense to them, that they can in fact understand, that is accessible to them, that is meaningful to them. And that takes an incredibly wide array of forms.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's why, the near-death experience is individual. There's as many and varied of them as there is individuals that have them. And so how can people get in touch with you if they want to, Jonathan?
Yeah, sure. The easiest thing to do is to, drop in on the old website. And you're welcome to drop me a note there. The website is assistthespirit.com.
All right. Well, we'll put
And
that in the show notes for the
yeah.
video. Any other way?
Oh, I often host, free gatherings where a lot of times we sit in silence together and then talk a little afterwards. And um, I'll, people can, sign up to work with me one-on-one, which happens fairly often and is a delightful way of engaging that whole thing, engaging this whole experience. And anyone is welcome to reach out and write to me. My attitude is that anyone is welcome to this table. So,
Okay.
um,
Now, don't feel obliged to say anything to this question because some people don't.
yeah.
Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with before we wrap it up?
I could think of a bunch of things, but at the moment, what comes to mind is just, I would want to encourage absolutely anyone listening that, that there is that that divinity that is, or that source or that spark is as so wholly and completely in you as much as it is in me or as in anyone. And to encourage the simple act of quieting down and giving it your best shot, to listen and see what it has to tell you, and to proceed accordingly as well you can. And feel free to reach out if you wish.
All right, excellent. Well, Jonathan, thanks for being on the show today. Thanks for helping us consider the question of who am I, and appreciate you being here today.
Rod, I appreciate it as well. Thank you very much, my man. Peace be with you.